I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Welcome back to Searching for Heroes. I'm your host, Benjamin Hall. Last week, we explored solitude as a choice, perhaps, with Chris Fagan, and she trekked to the South Pole on her own terms. But today's episode takes us somewhere very different. Solitude, perhaps, as part of survival. In 1982, Steve Callahan's boat was struck during a storm in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. What followed was one of the most extraordinary stories of endurance ever recorded. 76 days alone in a life raft, adrift at sea. Armed with only a short spear gun, a solar still, and a survival manual, Steven faced sharks, raft punctures, starvation, dehydration, and relentless sun. He speared fish from under the raft, drank water evaporated by the sun, and even created a floating ecosystem that eventually helped lead him to rescue. Steven didn't choose isolation, but in the face of it, he built a world of routine, learnt about resilience, and ultimately about reflection as well. And he would emerge changed, not just physically, but spiritually as well. So today we speak about what solitude does to the mind, to the body, to the soul, and what keeps a person going when there perhaps sometimes is no guarantee of tomorrow. How can you maybe even find beauty in the midst of suffering? So this is a conversation about what it means to survive and to live with meaning, even perhaps in the loneliest place on earth. And so joining me today is Steve Callahan. And Steve, thanks so much for being a guest today.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to talk about solitude, and I want to talk about the things that you really learned on board the raft. But I wondered if you would just go back to the beginning and briefly sort of talk to us about that night, the night when your boat was hauled, which you think was by a whale. When was that moment? What did it feel like when you realized that it was going down? And what were you going to do?
Complicated it a bit. I'll try to make it brief. Well, first of all, I kind of chose solitude. I spent a lot of my early life, running around in the woods, climbing mountains, and sailing. And a lot of the sailing I've done, even up to this date, has been shorthanded, maybe one or two other people on the boat. And of course, I was doing a single-handed sail at the time. So I had chosen that part to be alone. It just wasn't as long. I hadn't anticipated it would be 2.5 months alone in a raft.
Without food or water to start with.
Yeah, well, a little bit of food and a teeny bit of water. But anyway, as the boat was hauled, I'd prepared myself mentally. I'd read a lot of, survival books and I'd been a professional in the field for about a decade and knew people who had been on the edge before in various kinds of scenarios. So I took survival pretty seriously and knew what could happen. But as the moment occurred, there's suddenly a big bash and water flooding into the boat. I guess the first lesson I learned is that we tend to think of ourselves as making being single dimensional. We make a decision about something, things are good, they're bad, or whatever. And what I found was that my mind was operating on all kinds of different levels. There was a part of me that was totally freaked out being a little baby, crying, a part of me that was the disciplinarian and telling that part to shut the hell up and focus on what I needed to do. There was a part of me, even when I got up out of the inside of the boat and was trying to inflate the life raft, that was a bit amused because there was a film camera I had on the aft of the boat to take footage, and somehow the electrical system had kind of fused together or something and turned the camera on, was just taking this really dramatic footage in the middle of the ocean. So there are all these things going on in your head at the same time.
That's fascinating. Can I ask quickly then, was there almost a dialogue inside? So part of you was saying, what, I'm in the middle of nowhere, this is going down, almost screaming. Yeah. And then another part of you saying, almost actively saying, get that together. You've got to do what you know you have to do. And almost a dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. And actually anybody who, I wrote this book Adrift. about this whole thing. And it's actually one of the central themes because as time goes on, I kind of abstract myself into a rational and emotional and physical selves that are almost like three characters in the book, even though I'm alone. And each one has its own priorities and desires and fears, if you will. And so there's this constant struggle. If you look at survival scenarios, I've met survivors of all kinds of things through the years, and certainly read tons of literature about it and talked to survival psychologists and whatnot. And you can see this even reflected in common films like Castaway with Tom Hanks. He had his Wilson. You almost have to create these other reflections of yourself or different characters. And when we're by ourselves, we have these stresses that are kind of, they express themselves in different ways. But what it means in the final analysis when you're facing your day-to-day survival is that you do have these inner conflicts, that there's no decision that you make that doesn't involve dilemma. And a lot of it drifts sort of subtle themes, if you will, or things about the paradoxes and the ironies that are embedded in life every day. Like, for example, let's say it was blowing really hard. Well, that was great in terms of I'm drifting quickly to my destination, but it made it really hard to fish and really hard to produce water and so on. Everything had its flip side. And if I caught a fish, that was, my physical part of me was like, yeah, let's catch more. And, but this ecosystem that you had mentioned that developed around the raft, I considered myself sort of the mayor of Duckyville, as I called it, because I named my raft Rubber Ducky, was a thing which was inspiring, even in quite a spiritual center for myself in a sort of emotional way. And so I didn't really even want to catch fish. There they were swimming around, but there was a big part of me that it would be like me asking you to, kill one of your friends in order to survive. And certainly people in survival scenarios have faced these kind of extreme dilemmas, like the survivors of the Andes crash that led to the story Alive, where they were faced with, well, there's nothing to eat here except the bodies of our families and our friends. I was very fortunate compared to many because I had choices to make, but fortunately they didn't involve other people. But anyway, these conflicts are kind of buried everywhere, but we do have these different conflicting needs within us.
That's so fascinating because I think that's true in normal life as well. It's not as extreme as that. You're constantly drawn in two different directions, and it's about deciding, weighing up perhaps which is the most important. And you had to make that kind of decision very early on. Just as you were inflating the life raft, you suddenly realized you had to dive back into the sinking boat to get some supplies. And you knew, so you had a decision to make whereby you were going to risk your life to save your life. Again, you must have thought about both of those, but you knew, unless you did that, you were definitely going to die. So you had to take that risk.
Yeah, and obviously that's a huge judgment call. Survival psychologists sometimes call this ability to focus on, let's call it productive activity, as psychological splitting. Whereas people confronted with these crises are able to put aside dysfunctional behavior. Generally speaking, you can look at, oil rig fires and things like that. And I'm going to very much generalize here, but generally speaking, about 15% of the general populace will be quite dysfunctional. They'll totally freak out, run around with all kinds of dysfunctional behavior, maybe even have to be restrained from hurting themselves or other people or putting people in danger. About 15% of people will be able to be quite productive and be able to split themselves enough, at least, to determine, what are the risk factors here and how do I function best? And about 70% of people, roughly speaking, 2/3 say, can act positively, but they need direction. They're common stories like whether it's Twin Towers coming down or people caught in during the Second World War in the ghettos, when they're being carted off, who will have behaviors like going back to their desk and tidying up, or holding meetings to determine the course of action, which, of course, in these critical moments can mean the difference between life and death. We can all become better survivors. The training certainly does help. We've proven that for, training, and whether it's maritime stuff, like on oil rigs, where you go through the motion enough that it becomes kind of a bit of second nature. And for me, I was fortunate when this happened to me that, I dealt with emergencies offshore before many times. In fact, I often talk about, when you voyage offshore, you can't just park on the side of the road and hope for somebody's help. It's basically a problem-solving environment. And Murphy's Law is actually almost optimistic, because even things that can't possibly go wrong find some way to go wrong. And you're in with limited resources in a very isolated environment. So you kind of practiced on dealing with these things, and it helps when it really hits the fan.
I suppose it's interesting. You broke down the percentage of people and how they would respond in different ways. Where does that come from? What makes the 15% of people the ones who will get straight to it? Are you born with that? I know you mentioned training, but how do you end up being in one of those categories?
I guess that's beyond my pay grade to answer definitively.
But how about yourself? Because of the category you were in.
I think part of it's genetic, or could be genetic. But a lot of it is life experience. I grew up in an environment from the, post-war era, with a family that, my parents originally came from a very poor part of the country. And my father, was sort of the classic American dream kind of story. He was a hard worker. My whole family were hard workers, and we grew up being given a lot of responsibility. From the time we were born, really, some of my earliest memories were lugging rocks to help build a chimney for the house that our family built. And like I said, I grew up in an area where surrounded by people who were, doing things like camping. We did a lot of camping and then sailing, where you learn on a routine basis to deal with problems, taking responsibility. For me, one of the challenges, I think, of America is to realize that, yes, there's a sort of a yin yang balance between freedom and responsibility. They go hand in hand.
Gosh, I wonder if
yeah,
you talk about the post-war generation that believed in hard work and had these morals. It's a sort of wider question, but do you think maybe that is diminishing? Do you think perhaps society is forgetting that?
Short answer is yes. I guess. I certainly, I don't know. I think we have pretty high expectations in life, and but people who are you start facing the true crises in your life, and your world perspective changes. And certainly that did for me, even through this voyage. It probably was enhanced, and it didn't change exactly, but it was certainly enhanced. That feeling of in that sort of, again, a sort of yin yang balance, where I was in many ways sort of tortured and was surrounded by kind of constant pain and in those sorts of things. But I was also finding huge rewards from the, in a way, the kind of ultimate freedom that such things offer. I remember having a discussion with one of the survivors of the Andes crash that I had mentioned before, that many people know their stories. And we were in a green room before a TV show. And one of the delights of that is often hanging out with other people who've gone through really extreme events and chit-chatting about this and that. And I've had this conversation with many people who've fallen off of cliffs and stuff like that. And we often talk about that, almost what sports people talk about, being in the zone. You're just completely present. And there's a certain kind of spiritual high from that, where the past doesn't mean that much, the future doesn't mean that much. It's what you do and how you do it right now, right at this moment that you're totally focused on. And so during this conversation, we were talking about this element of the balance between these torturous issues, but the purity of the experience itself. And he just made this quick remark. He said, yeah, you know what? Sometimes I just wish I was back in the mountains again. And I could not imagine a more horrible situation than the one he had been in. And yet he found things of huge value in that experience that you could not have had in any other way. Just the depth of relationships, in his case with his mates, and in my case with the environment.
More of our conversation right after this. You know, that's fascinating because a couple of years ago, one of the reasons I started this podcast was that I was injured in Ukraine. Our team was blown up and I was there for 40 minutes. You know, I lost my legs and I was there for 40 minutes. And I look back at that moment and then the 6 months, in hospital in a similar way. It's amazing you see that. Like there was one goal. All the other chit chat, all the things you get in your normal life sort of disappeared. Right. And actually, there's something really pure about those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm in my 70s now, and it's certainly, I've been around the block more than a few dozen times, including I had leukemia, very as challenging as being in the life raft, actually, but in a totally different way. And while in hospital, for example, I can't tell you how deeply moved I was by the care that I got by other people, that you see it and you feel it in a very visceral way. That's hard, that you cannot really share with anybody else wholly unless they've been in the same kind of situation, or it can be a totally different situation, but as critical. And I was so touched by humanity's capacity for compassion and care. And I suppose we don't see every day, so there's all kinds of benefits that can come out of these things.
And I suppose there are different ways of handling it. One is to just totally embrace it and realize, and it changes your life for the positive, and it makes you want to go out and give that back to other people. Or I think there are other people who want to never remember those moments. And I do think that people go in two different directions.
Yeah. Even within ourselves, even now, I'm doing the psychological splitting. I think I told you there's a new documentary of the drift that's come out. And so there's been a kind of resurgence and interested in my old fishtail. And it brings a lot back. And there
positive, negative?
It's both. A balance. To be honest, it's a total balance. I am very moved that so many people can relate to the story, people who have never even seen the ocean before. And that's happened immediately after my feet hit the beach back in 1982, that people would reach out to me and share incredibly touching and revealing parts of their own histories and how they could relate to elements of my story. Despite the fact that they might be a farmer in Ohio or somebody in Texas, we all go through the same things, but in terms of psychology and the stages, I'm not unique. That's for sure.
It's fascinating. It does. If people know you have gone through something really difficult, it makes many people want to share more with you, which I think is quite a gift. People want to come and share with you really personal things or difficult things they've gone through. And sometimes I think that doesn't happen enough in society. Too many people keep it inside. And so, I've always found that quite positive when people see, for example, my prosthetic legs, and they immediately want to start talking about something that they've gone through.
Yes,
that's good.
Exactly. And I suppose in your case, it's led you down this road to do this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things you have said drove you while you were, in the life raft in the middle of nowhere, was that you've talked about how your life was almost in shambles, that you had too much unfinished business. And it kind of ties back to what you were saying earlier. You came from this background where you went out to do things and you were thinking a lot, I haven't done enough in my life. I believe your marriage wasn't going, broken apart. But so you still wanted to build something. And that was a driving factor for you.
Yeah. I'll give a couple of references here. One is to the great Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote On Death and Dying, which I had read when I was in college. It was a new
Hmm.
book at that time. And it examines the stages that people go through as they reach the end of their life, and providing that it's not an immediate, run over by a truck, but especially people who are, facing cancer or anything like that, who have a time to kind of process things. These stages of death and dying. And I often say, well, basically, survivors go through the exact same stages, except the end, which is acceptance. We reject that. We go as long as we can anyway. We go through the anger, the bargaining, the this and the that, and finally the aim is to reach adaptation. But in the end, of course, if you actually are going to die, you have to reach acceptance. But
Or
survivors
embrace. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
they don't quite get to that point. The other reference is Viktor Frankl, who was
Yeah.
in concentration camps during the Second World War, and wrote a number of books. Man's Search for Meaning, I would recommend to every person on the planet to read. It's an incredible book. His attitudes, his ability to psychologically split while being in this most horrendous situation that you could possibly imagine, and how he could find empathy for the guards of the concentration camp, how he could find beauty even in that situation. And he comes down to, I think, the universal human need of meaning. What is the meaning of our life, and how do we create meaning? And so I was going through these stages, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages, in a way. And in one of the most difficult parts of the survival voyage is not the escaping the immediate threat, not getting out of the boat, but then it's the second stage, which is now what? Your whole life has kind of been flushed down the toilet, and it's hard to figure out, goodness gracious, how can I possibly, create a new life from this? And a part of that is meaning, is latching on to a need for meaning. My life felt very empty, as you note, full of failures. Not that it isn't still. I've had plenty of failures, but through it all, I think it gave me the impetus to say, okay, but I'm here. I know what to do, even though I had what I find a near universal feeling during that really difficult stage of recoil of, no, I'm doomed. Almost all survivors at the beginning go, forget it. There's no way. I'm just a person. I can't make it out of this. But slowly you develop these techniques, if you will, to take it step by step to what I say is to divide the overall overwhelming task into achievable steps.
Yeah, and
And peck away at them.
you had moments where that clicked in, where times where you said it's all done, and then you suddenly you said no, I've got to get up, I've got to fix the raft, I've got to do this and that. And again, I'm fascinated in that one little moment. You know, if for anyone going through something difficult, where do you get that moment to say no, it's not over, I am going to do what I've got to do, and up you get and you keep going. And you've said that you were amazed to find how much resilience you actually had. Most people don't know how much resilience they have until they really need it, until their back is against the wall. But you found that. What is that moment?
Part of it is from achievement. I've talked about hope to people. I don't think hope is just wishful thinking. You don't like sit back and just go, oh yeah, I hope my life is going to have meaning. It's not like that. Hope is something you build step by step. And I think my entire life history played into it, as it does for all of us. That I had often faced challenges, and they're not easy all the time to face these challenges. But when you get through them, it's like, oh, that's a great reward. I had taken offshore shorthanded trips where let's say doing races offshore, where I didn't win the race, but I instead, let's say the rudder fell off the boat and I was able to effect a repair some kind of a jury rig that would work, and got myself to the other end and then finished mid-fleet. I mean, that would, to me, was a huge, huge success, that we can find these rewards from taking small achievable steps. In the life raft, that was things like getting a solar still to work that, as far as I know, to this date, these were produced during the Second World War, but could not be used as directed. And I had incredible trouble getting them to work at all, and ended up being challenged by them basically every day, but they produced just enough water for me to survive. So that was a huge success. When I holed the bottom of the raft on the 43rd day, which just about did kill me, where I came very close to that line of acceptance that, no, this is the end of the line. After 10 days, I think it was about 10 days of struggling to fix this critical problem.
It was the fork. Yeah,
I handled to a fork ended up being the solution. But, in the end, I mean, I often reference, or movies. I'm a big movie buff. And Castaway has this brilliant scene, which Joe Ween, who made this documentary, incorporates in it, where I describe this, which is, I'm right on the edge of death. I've tried everything I could possibly figure out. I have no backup in terms of somebody else's opinion who probably could have solved the problem in 15 minutes. And in the end, just this forcing myself right at that critical moment where really I was not going to have much of a choice anymore. I figured I had one more shot at it, and I went through all of the gear that I had and so on, and finally stumbled on this idea of how to fix it. And when I fixed it, honestly, it was like I was king of the world. It's like when Tom Hanks is going around the fire going, look at me, and that kind of a high was about the biggest high of my life, even though it's a simple little thing.
Would that then have been followed afterwards by a big low? Like, do you suddenly get the endorphins that lift you up, and then you realize you are back where you are? You're still in the middle of the ocean. You're still just floating around. So, I'm sure you're familiar with this, or I imagine you are. Maybe your experience is quite different, but I often talk about, survival is normal life just on steroids, as we like to say, that we all go through periods of ups and downs, highs and lows. But in a crisis situation, the lows tend to be incredibly low and the highs tend to be incredibly high. And they're often like really compressed, where you can be 1 minute on the edge of like wanting to just say, I'm done. I'm getting out of the raft and swimming away from this or whatever. And the next you're the king of the world. It's really quite an amazing up and down experience. What was the experience like when you were finally rescued? When this fisherman found you, you were just off this island, and immense high there as well.
Oh God, yeah. I was drifting up to I'd been navigating. I had a kind of an idea of where I was, but I kept expecting to see islands, day after day after day, and so I didn't know if I had was totally bonkers and my navigation was way off, and my next step was getting swept up in the Gulf Stream, and next stop England, and all the way around the gyre. And finally, I saw the island, and it was like, again, it's this sort of yin yang balance of feelings, because the island was like, there it is, right there. I'm going to end this voyage today, but would have been incredibly difficult, dangerous as hell, because half the island's coral cliffs, and the other half had a reef outside of it, and it's like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. And then fishermen came out to pick me up, and they came out in like most fishermen who have a depth of what a friend of mine calls natural literacy. They go out to sea, they see these birds hovering over the raft, and that's because of the ecosystem, which had kept me alive, threatened me many times, had become my kind of spiritual center. And there it was. I was in the middle of it. So they came out to find fish and find me. And when I saw them, I mean, it was like an immediate relief. And overall, I think the big feeling that I had both at that moment and in the ensuing days, especially, was like I had been hanging over the Grand Canyon sitting on a knife edge. It wasn't comfortable. I could somehow deal with it, but the only option was to plunge. And suddenly somebody withdrew that to the edge, and I was standing on the cliff with no stress, none. It just like all whoosh, disappeared. And everything in my life at that time was totally different. When I could, just the, and I talk about this often, just the clattering of palm fronds, the colors of hibiscus, the sound of birds, the voice of this guy who was like in this little hospital where they took me for the afternoon. And I had awakened. He was doing dishes down below and had this booming, beautiful voice. I mean, everything like that was like it was like every sense I had was plugged into an amplifier. And it was almost literally like being what I imagined being born is like, where every sensation is brand new and appreciated. So that also was just an amazing high.
What came next? What did it change your whole view on how you wanted to live life, on what your dreams were, on how you mustn't take anything for granted? What were the big differences, and did you embrace them?
Yeah. I guess the short answer is yes on all the above. I mean, I had always appreciated what came out of facing challenges. I think my entire life has been defined mostly by kind of project-oriented things where I would find something interesting. But the things that interested me were things that were not that common, let's say. Not that they were totally unique or anything like that, but not that many people had done before. They're different and difficult. I often reference Dodge Morgan, the first American to sail around the world nonstop, single-handed. And when people ask him, well, why on earth would you want to do that? He said, because it's different and difficult. And what I think I have found overall, and certainly from this voyage, was that fulfillment is the greatest source of meaning in my life. And fulfillment it's not just having fun. I mean, I don't have anything against fun. But fulfillment is often derived from dealing with problems, facing them, chipping away at them, building your hope, building your success. And it doesn't always have to be the success that you imagine to start with. Sometimes you find out something completely different, or you learn so much from the little failures. Thomas Edison who did like 10,000 experiments before he found the right filament for the light bulb. Was once asked, well, how does it feel to fail 10,000 times? And he says, I didn't fail 10,000 times. I just discovered 10,000 ways that didn't work. So we go through these processes, and they're difficult, but we learn so much. Kathy, my wife, she says the I don't know, kind of the focus of Adrift, which came straight from the little logs that I was scribbling on these little pads all the way through this journey. And she said the sort of center of your story to me is this line: it's a view of heaven from the seat in hell. And we've talked about these other issues like, well, what do you discover and all of that? Well, I discovered that, like all survivors I've spoken with, that we are more resilient and a lot stronger than we ever give ourselves credit for until we go through these processes. But to me, what's sort of equally important were, what are my failures? What are the things that I can improve? And so hopefully I carried those into the rest of my life. It doesn't mean that I'm not a person. I have a bad temper. I can be short term. I was probably the most patient person on the planet. And forgiving of everything. But a longer term, sometimes it makes me very impatient with people. It's like, why don't you get this? So it's a mixed bag, but especially afterwards, I don't forget what starvation actually feels like. Fortunately, we don't remember pain exactly, but I do know where it brought me to and what it's like. And I know what it's like to not have enough water to survive, where having an ounce of water is precious. So it does realign, priorities and things in that way.
More of our conversation right after this. Yeah. Goodness, what a perfect place to finish up as well. And I think I was going to ask, for people who are finding it difficult to get over a hurdle or struggling to motivate themselves, what advice would you give? But you've just kind of given it. You just sort of laid that out really nicely. But is there one last thing that you would say to anyone that they might be able to channel?
Oh, I don't know. We've covered quite a lot, actually, in a very short time, conceptually. Geez, I'm not sure as I have a good answer for that. Everybody has to walk their own path, and everybody is going to have moments where they feel true despair. When you're in a crisis mode, it doesn't matter even if you're surrounded by other people. In many ways, you are still alone. When I was going through leukemia, it was a totally different kind of a situation where instead of having nobody to rely upon around me, I was totally dependent on all kinds of other people, a totally different situation. But in both situations, I was alone in a way. But just keep faith in yourself that you can discover a way to take small, achievable steps towards the end goal. Don't focus too much on the end goal, but where you are and what you can gain from it. I was seeing, like I say, a view of heaven from a seat in hell. Even while I was in that situation and being tortured, I could see beauty and connection and an awareness of things that I could not have been aware of in any other environment. Saw in things of incredible beauty and touched me deeply to my soul. So if you open yourself to that, I think it helps to take those achievable steps.
Yeah. Wow. Beautifully, beautifully said. Steve, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for sharing this with us. We really appreciate it. And, I know everything you're going to do will be channeled through that way. And, thank you for sharing it.
Well, thank you, Benjamin, and good luck in your own journey.
Yeah, thank you very much, and to yours. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.